time I was here was when I was a student 3 years ago. And I remember, even a couple years before that, just stumbling on the Cambio de Colores website and the Cambio Center online and just thinking, oh my gosh, this is what I've been dreaming of. This is the conversation and the community I've been dreaming of. So to get to come and present a few years ago and then now to have the privilege of speaking to the full group is really wonderful. So thank you so much. I'm going to give a talk today about some work that's kind of in progress here at the University of Iowa. The title is Tenemos muchos héroes en este pueblo, which means we have many heroes in this town. And I'm going to talk about a few different projects that are engaging communities to talk about ways rural residents are responding to stress related to immigration and immigration enforcement. And so I'm going to give a little bit of a background on me because I don't think this will be a pure research talk. It'll also be a bit about just my path as a young scholar to become more of a community engaged researcher. And then a little bit of background just about what's going on, especially in Iowa, because that's the place I've really focused. And then to kind of dive into specifically immigration enforcement, the reasons that I argue immigration enforcement matters for the health of communities. And then lastly, to look at these two research projects engaging communities to understand the ways they're responding to our current immigration climate. And I hope at the end we'll have little time for questions and conversation. So a little background on me. I'm from Iowa, from a multi-generational Iowan family. I was born in Iowa City when my parents were students there. So I've not actually been much of a rural resident myself, but I have had a lot of close affection and respect for rural communities, both through my dad's family, which has had farming relationships throughout eastern Iowa for a long time. My grandpa was a traveling salesman of veterinary medications to farmers. And then growing up, my father worked in a small town, so we'd spend a lot of time out in rural places. And I think I just always held that close to my heart, and it's something that I've tried to bring more into my area of public health, which has a strong rural health focus, but especially social epidemiology, which looks at inequalities in health, that has looked less at rural communities, and so it's something I've tried to bring in. And I began to develop an understanding of immigration in the Midwest in 2007 when I was working at mobile clinics for migrant agricultural workers in eastern Iowa. There's two people here in the room today actually that still work with that group. It's called Proteus, and they're the contractor for migrant health services in all of Iowa and a few other places as well. So as a young person, I spoke Spanish, but I didn't know a lot about what was going on in my state and the real diversity of my state until I started, getting in these vans and driving out into, sometimes barns, sometimes old school buildings, sometimes big seed treatment companies, and meeting people who had come to the state I was from to detassel corn, to treat seeds, sometimes to work with hogs. They were really filling this essential role that, held up so much of the state's economy that we're so proud of. And they were also wonderful people who had incredible journeys and were very kind to me when I would show up in their space out in the fields of Iowa. And that really stuck with me. Throughout my journey, I went on to study epidemiology, which is the kind of basic science of public health at the University of Michigan. And then I was very happy to come back to my home state of Iowa to learn more about community engaged research methods. And I think that's the kind of last part of the journey that I'll be sharing today is, moving away from more secondary data analysis, sitting in my office and using a big data set, which was a really important thing to do, but to also think about, what's going on out there? How can I have better research questions? How can I listen to the people who are most affected by these issues and make sure to do research that elevates that experience and that voice? So that's what I'd like to share today. Another thing I like to cover when I talk about immigration in Iowa, and I think it probably applies to the Midwest as a whole, is we live in a time when immigration is really racialized. So racialization is a term from sociology about the ways that we have narratives, and there's these processes our culture goes through where we start to equate a group of people with a set of characteristics. So a really good example of that is Latinos in the US, especially right now, we have a lot of conversation that kind of assumes that many immigrants are Latino and most Latinos are immigrants. And that kind of equation of Latino with immigrant does not hold in many places in the US, including in Iowa. And so today I'm going to be talking sometimes about Latinx communities and sometimes about immigrants. And that racialization process means that it is important to understand the impact of immigration on all Latinos in the Midwest, but I also don't want to perpetuate the idea that all Latinos are immigrants or vice versa. And so just to give the case of Iowa, this is just a bit of recent statistics about who are immigrants in Iowa right now. And you can see that immigrants from Latin America are the largest group, 39%, but very closely followed by immigrants from Asia and then other continents around the world. And also, there are many Latinos in Iowa who have been there for many generations, longer than a lot of white people in Iowa. So this is an example from, Buxton is a town near a community that I do a lot of work in called Ottumwa. And this is Maggie and Norberto Rodriguez, who are from Mexico, and they came to Buxton, Iowa. This is a photo from 1918 to work in coal mining there. This is another photo from Holy City, which is a little area in Bettendorf, Iowa, along the Mississippi River, where there was also many Mexican migrants who came in the early 20th century. This photo is from 1922. And so we have a long history of immigration here in Iowa, and I imagine in Missouri as well, and that's something I like to highlight as well when I give these talks. And then similarly, Latinos are not the only people affected by immigration-related stress. So this was an incident a year ago when in Iowa we have a lot of refugees from Burma, and there was a mistake in the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services computer system, and many Burmese residents in Iowa got this letter saying that they had concerns about their identity and their biographic information, and then they needed to report to the field office in Indianapolis to get fingerprinted and prove their identity. It ended up turning out that this was sent in error, but understandably it sent a lot of fear throughout the community. So while today I'll be focusing on the experiences of Latino communities based on the groups I've been able to partner with and my own skills speaking Spanish, but I don't mean to by any means suggest that Latinos are the only groups affected by these stresses right now. So today I'm going to talk about immigration enforcement, and I just wanted to couch that in kind of a bit of a broader set of definitions. Luckily, I think this audience is a little more up on this than some of my audiences. But just broadly, immigration policy, I would say, in layman's terms, is the set of rules that defines who can be in the U.S., under what means or reasons they're allowed to come to the U.S., and then what services and resources you're entitled to in the U.S. So for example, right now most of our immigration system is focused around family reunification, coming for work, or seeking asylum. And then we have people who maybe don't fit into those boxes, and I'm not an immigration lawyer, but we have this set of rules that makes it easier for some groups of people to come than others. And then similarly, those rules help us define who has access to supportive resources, things like Medicaid and Medicare, which help us access health care, other resources like SNAP or WIC, which are nutrition assistance programs. So that would all fit under the umbrella of immigration policy. And then I focus more specifically on immigration enforcement, which is sort of embedded in immigration policy, but it's the set of practices that usually the government undertakes to enforce immigration law, so to decide what to do if someone is here and they do not fit in one of those boxes. They might be unauthorized, or they might be someone with a visa or even permanent residency, but because of criminal charges or other things, they might be no longer considered eligible to stay in the US. And then another important kind of backdrop to all of this is immigration climate. And that's just sort of the broader moment we live in, the turbulent times that I mentioned in the conference title today, where we have a lot of tension around immigration, a lot of stress about who is an immigrant, our ideas about who's deserving, about who's suspicious. And that's where we get into some of those ideas of racialization that I mentioned earlier, that kind of public cultural conversation, which is also a really important influence on people's lives and then also on health. And so, that was my definition. We have really good evidence in public health that our immigration policies are linked to people's, not just their access to healthcare, but their actual physical health and their well-being. So these are some papers from when there were these omnibus state immigration laws. That's when they would pass kind of a whole bunch of changes to their state immigration policies at once. So both looking in Arizona and in Alabama, and looking at the ways that people had lower access to healthcare and sometimes even worse birth outcomes for pregnant women after those state laws changed. Another great body of research has looked at the DACA policy, which was implemented under President Obama. So that's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And it's a kind of relief from deportation for a period of time for people who came during childhood. And there's some really strong studies looking at the ways that people who were granted that relief from deportation, which usually comes with an ability to drive if you lived in a state that didn't let you have a driver's license, and a work authorization, people who were able to access DACA had better mental health themselves. And then this really incredible study found that the children's health, the children's emotional well-being and cognitive performance actually was better after their mothers were granted DACA. So those are some examples of immigration policy mattering for health. Immigration enforcement, I defined earlier. And broadly, I would divide that into border enforcement and interior enforcement. And I think we live in a time where there's been a lot of conversation about our border enforcement. I think you can't look at the news without understanding really important and crucial issues that are going on our border. But here in Missouri, in Iowa, a lot of what affects the communities we're working with is also the interior enforcement. And interior immigration enforcement can include a few different things. So this can include federal immigration enforcement, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. They can collaborate with local law enforcement. This is a fluid area of government policy, but broadly, the Secure Communities Program was one where people, if they came into contact with local immigration enforcement, they could have their fingerprints and other information shared with federal immigration enforcement, which could mean that a contact with a local police officer could turn into immigration enforcement for you. And there's also 287G, which has flipped on and off, but is currently on, and means that local law enforcement can be deputized to act as immigration enforcement. Other ways that interior enforcement might look is large-scale raids on workplaces, which I'm going to talk about more. And then there's also raids on people's homes or individuals, so they might come after a person with a warrant. And so as a public health researcher, I understand health really broadly. I don't think only about your particular disease or whether or not you're able to go to the doctor, but also the conditions you live in and whether it makes it easy for you to be healthy and have access to the resources and support you need. And there's a lot of reasons to think that our current immigration enforcement environment matters for people's health. However, it can be really hard to study. So first of all, it's pretty difficult to measure what's going on with immigration enforcement, not because there's not a lot of it going on, but because we don't always get great data. And there's many different, as I mentioned, pathways by which people can be affected by ICE. And it's often covert and unseen. In my work in Ottumwa, Iowa, multiple people have talked to me about an event where somebody got pulled over and then as far as people could tell locally, they just never saw that person again. And it's hard to know, where is the data on that arrest? How would I count that arrest if I was going to look at what's happening across our state or across our country? It's also chronically occurring. So this is a really big challenge in all health inequality research. But when you have something that's just systematically affecting one group of people, it's hard to find your comparison group. Who's the group of people who are just like mixed status communities in the US, but they don't experience the stress of immigration enforcement? We don't have a great comparison group for that. There's always some level of immigration enforcement going on, and we don't have a great counterfactual from research perspective to know what would it be like, how healthy could people be if this wasn't happening to them. And then also the impacts are really diffuse. So this isn't something that just affects your blood sugar and your risk of diabetes. It's something that might have implications for your mental health. It might have implications for your blood pressure, your blood glucose, your risk for a lot of different chronic conditions. It might affect your health behaviors, whether you feel comfortable going outside to exercise, whether you think it's worth it to go to the grocery store on the other side of town that has better fruits and vegetables, or maybe today you'll just go to the one that's closer because it's a little less scary. And then, of course, it affects service utilization. And I think we're going to have some discussions tomorrow about our current policy environment and access to supportive services and the way that we've had a real chilling effect on families' willingness to access even services that they're completely entitled to. Despite all of those research challenges, there's really solid evidence at this point that immigration enforcement matters for people's health. So people have found that different dimensions of immigration enforcement policy and practice have been linked to prenatal care utilization, participation in Medicaid, which is health care for low-income communities, food insecurity. Stephanie Potocznik is a researcher here at University of Missouri, mental health, self-rated health, which is a very powerful marker of someone's well-being, people's trust in government information related to health, people's insurance uptake under the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. And so we've really documented that these immigration enforcement practices can matter for people's health and their access to services. And there's also a lot of evidence that these effects spill over. So they don't matter just for people who are themselves unauthorized, but they can matter for family members of someone who's unauthorized, or even more broadly, Latino communities. A lot of research has looked at Latinos in general in a particular community, and if overall, regardless of immigration status, you're seeing worse health or lower uptake of services. And people have called that spillover effects. So I'm going to share one study that I did back when I was a PhD student. I was polishing it up when I was at Cambio de Colores 3 years ago. It's now published. And this is kind of from my epidemiology phase of life, but I think it underlies a lot of the motivation to go into community engaged work, which I'll talk about after that. So that summer I was working for Proteus, for the mobile clinics for migrant workers in Iowa. There was what was at the time the largest single site worksite raid in US history. Who here has heard of the immigration raid in Postville, Iowa? You guys are my audience. This is good. So I won't bore you if you already know about it, but I do think it's really important to tell this story because it's still something that affects people to this day. Naomi and I went a year ago to the 10-year anniversary in Postville, and that event is very much alive in the minds and the spirits, and I would say the bodies of people in that community, and people in Guatemala and all around the world who feel connected to it. So this is my beautiful, beautiful home state of Iowa, and Postville is way up there in the northeast corner. Postville is a town of about 2,000 people. It's a very rural community. And on May 12th, 2008, as I mentioned, there was the largest raid in US history. It took place at a meat processing plant. It was a plant that processed cattle. And 900 ICE agents were deployed to this town of 2,000 people. They arrested 389 of the workers. 98% of the workers who were arrested were Latino. Ultimately, 297 were deported. So needless to say, even just if you think about the numbers, like the proportion of the town that was affected by this event is so dramatic. And there's ways that the Postville Raid was a really extreme event, something never before seen, really unimaginable. But there's also ways that it's actually quite typical of immigration enforcement in the US right now. So I'm going to just talk a bit about that. One thing is that it was a highly militarized event, which is also typical. So this is the civilian equivalent of a Black Hawk helicopter, and that was how most people knew that something was up that day, as they could hear this helicopter circling over town. Not to get too far ahead of myself, but I'm later going to be talking about other immigration raids that took place last year, and the helicopter is a recurring theme. The agents were all armored. They had the bulletproof vests, and they had weapons. And another thing that is typical of immigration enforcement, and definitely happened in Postville, was the use of racial profiling to decide who was suspected of being unauthorized. So a lot of eyewitness accounts were that they just sorted people out by what they perceived their race or ethnicity to be, and they asked for documentation from the workers who they thought were Hispanic or Latino. That's also something we hear in a lot of places. And then what we're learning is a really predictable cascade of events, and really horrifying is just this mass chaos and uncertainty that will kind of pervade a town after something like this happens or while it's happening. So this is a tough photo to look at, but it's families waiting outside the plant to try to see if their loved one was one of the ones who was arrested that day. In the communities that we're working with right now, it often takes up to a week to even just figure out who got arrested, because people are hiding, people sometimes are just not showing up, and so it's hard to know who was detained and where they are, how many kids are left behind, things like that. This is, if you work with immigrant communities today, this might be a familiar sight to you, but a lot of the women who had children were allowed to go back home, but they had to keep these electric monitors on to track their location, and they have to plug into the wall for several hours a day. There are people probably all over Missouri right now who are wearing those, and if you don't plug in, it will, you get in huge trouble because then they can't track where you are anymore. So they were allowed to go home to be with their kids, but they were still in the deportation proceedings. And then I think the other thing that you just can't overstate is just the amount of kind of fear that pervaded the community. So this is actually a photo from St. Bridget's Catholic Church, which served as a true sanctuary in Postville during this time. Many families slept in there for a few days. But you know, this photo, even inside the church, even inside the safest place they had in town, still feeling afraid to show your face, says a lot. And as a health researcher, just thinking about the physiological impact of that level of fear is really impactful. The workers were brought to Waterloo, Iowa, where the men were kept in a cattle fairground called the National Cattle Congress, and the women were kept in a local jail while they awaited their trial. And then another thing that is increasingly common is having the immigrants do their hearings in groups. So instead of going up one by one and having an immigration lawyer discuss your case, they would go up in groups of 10. And the interpreter who regularly interpreted for deportation proceedings, his name is Eric Camaid Frejas, and he's someone who participated in these things regularly, but this particular case was so extreme that he actually ended up kind of breaking his professional commitment to not talk about what happened, and he wrote a piece for the New York Times about his concerns about the way that this case was handled. Many of the workers were indigenous, and Spanish was not their first language, but they were being asked to take a pretty nasty plea deal in a group of 10 in a language that was not their own. So there was a lot of concerns, from a humanitarian perspective, from a legal perspective. And then, what I think about in public health is, not just the legal and personal impacts for the people detained that day, which are indescribable, but also the ways that this was a communal event. This was something that affected people all over our state, all over the state I'm from. And I knew that partly because I was there that summer working with migrant agricultural workers, but then I also just started to look at newspapers from around this state and found a lot of evidence that this wasn't just a Postville issue. There were a lot of places all around Iowa, and I would venture to guess in Missouri and Nebraska and Illinois that felt connected to this event. So this is a headline from La Prensa, which is a Spanish language newspaper in western Iowa. So hundreds of miles away from Postville. And the headline here is, "Raids Create Uncertainty in Denison." And it says, due to multiple phone calls in the editor's office of this publication, there's a rumor that an ICE agent is asking for papers from workers at farmland in Denison during the change in shifts on the morning of the 27th of this month. So this is May 27th, 15 days after the Postville raid. You can tell from the headline, "Raids Create Uncertainty." This has kind of triggered a series of rumors and fears all over the state. And farmland is a meat processing plant, very similar to the one in Postville. And there was even some explicit identification with the community in Postville. So this headline, "No somos animales," we are not animals, using "we" all the way on the western side of Iowa to talk about what they saw in Postville and objecting to the housing of the men in the cattle facility. So there's, I think, really strong evidence that people all over Iowa felt like this was an event that was relevant to them. We had more evidence that people didn't just feel scared, but they started to respond. People held Know Your Rights workshops. People had lawyers help them arrange powers of attorney for their children in case there was a follow-up raid. And then there were even kind of structural changes in the wake of that raid. I've heard this in Ottumwa, where I do a lot of work, and there's a meat processing plant there too. But also this article's from Perry, which basically local business people would be turning to the mayor and saying, "Make sure we're not the next Postville, make sure we don't have a raid here." And then the mayor would in turn turn to the meatpacking plant and say, "Who are you employing? Is there a risk that we could be raided?" And there's reports that a lot of workers were let go in the wake of that raid. And even that there was kind of that racializing assumption that maybe you just shouldn't hire a Latino worker because maybe they're undocumented, you don't know. So there was a big shift in who worked in meatpacking plants in Iowa after this raid. And those are things that, from a health perspective, matter as well. So people losing their jobs, people having that kind of economic stress, that matters for your health too. And then I think it's really important to just talk about racism and discrimination. And there's a lot of reports that in the wake of that event, and this is not surprising in 2019, but when the government sends messages that exclude a certain group of people, more people feel kind of entitled to express that view as well. So this was someone who drove to Postville to hold this sign after the raid. And so, from a public health perspective, I'm going to go through this a little quickly because I want to get to the community engaged part. But we know that stress and these types of stressors matter for people's health in a lot of ways. I'm especially interested in the health of women and children, and ended up working with some colleagues at the University of Michigan to think about birth outcomes after really stressful events. So we know that after earthquakes, terrorist attacks, other kinds of wars, tornadoes, there's usually an increase in the rate of adverse birth outcomes following that event. So these kind of population level stressful events can matter for people's health. And we wondered whether the Postville Raid might be something that was stressful enough to matter for the health of infants who were in utero at the time of the raid. We have good reasons to believe that there's a biological mechanism for that. One of the explanations is the stress hormone cortisol, which normally when a fetus is developing, there's an enzymatic kind of barrier that helps the mom process the cortisol into an inactive kind of metabolite, which doesn't affect the fetus as much. But when women are under a lot of stress, there's more cortisol, and they actually downregulate that enzymatic barrier, so more cortisol can get through to the baby. And we know from animal studies that that is not good for their growth and development. So we worked together to get birth certificate data from the whole state of Iowa, from the Iowa Department of Public Health. And we kind of replicated models that people had used in previous studies to look at changes in birth outcomes after this raid. So we looked at babies born in the 37 weeks after the raid. That's the minimum length of a full term, so trying to get babies who would have been in their mom at the time the raid happened. And this is in all of Iowa, this isn't just Postville. And then we compared them to babies born in that same 37-week period, but 1 year earlier, and then that same 37-week period 2 years earlier. And we did that because there's some seasonality in birth outcomes, so we don't want to be comparing winter babies to summer babies, things like that. And this is just going to be the descriptive data. I later applied regression models and other things which you can see when you look at the whole paper. But the main thing to show is that rates of low birth weight were relatively stable from 2006 to 2007, when those were years that May 12th was not a meaningful date. It was just kind of another day. But if you look at babies who are born after May 12th, 2008, you see a big increase in the risk of low birth weight for two groups. So you can see that infants born to non-Latino white moms, that's this blue line, it actually went down a little bit, which was what was happening nationwide with low birth weight at that time. But for both immigrant and US-born Latina moms, we saw this jump in risk of low birth weight. And that withstood, adjusting for other things that might have explained it. We looked at the distribution of birth weights. We really checked it out, and it was actually the biggest increase in risk of low birth weight in a 10-year period in the Latino population in Iowa. So we have a lot of reason to believe that this was a real thing, and that kind of stressful event wasn't just something that mattered for you if you got arrested that day, but being part of a community that was targeted like that could matter for your health. So that was in 2008. We went on to have a change in our immigration enforcement policy in the US. So Barack Obama was elected later that year. And I think it's really important to highlight that deportations did not go down under President Obama. They actually went up to the highest level they had ever been. People called him the deporter-in-chief. But the way that he did it was different. The way that the Obama administration did it was different. They used a lot of that Secure Communities program, which I mentioned, so collaborating with local law enforcement. The idea was to be prioritizing people who had a criminal record But people who have studied criminal justice in our country know that your path to a criminal record can also vary by your income level, by your race. Some of the things that are defined as criminal that we're getting people into the deportation system could include driving without a license, for example, which is hard to do when you're not allowed to have a license. So there were ways that a lot of people were deported throughout the Obama administration. And then we're still in a moment of high deportations today. The strategies are multifold. This is a graph from a map from the National Immigration Law Center about the degree to which local law enforcement are involved in deportations or in collaborating with ICE. I'd encourage you to look up their report that kind of explains this in more detail. But I think what you can see is that a lot of the Midwest region, we have a pretty high degree of involvement with ICE. The level that the red states are at mean that they're actively detaining people for ICE, and the orange counties are places where they're handing people over to ICE, either through detainers or other processes. But we live in a moment where a lot of the region that all of us care about is affected by this. Another thing that I'm really interested in is, what does it mean in rural places or places where there's not as many immigrants? Do we see more immigration enforcement because people are not having the resources to protect themselves? Do we see less because people are under the radar? And luckily, a paper just came out last year looking at this. What it found is that places with low concentrations of Hispanics or Latinos actually tend to have a higher rate of turning people over to federal immigration enforcement after they come into contact with local police. So places that have like a middle level, 25 to 40% concentration of Hispanic residents have more protection from deportation, but these rural communities where Latinos and Hispanics live in large numbers but don't always make up a huge proportion of the population, they're actually more vulnerable to kind of getting turned over for deportation by local police. So there's ways that, we have this literature about immigration enforcement and health. It tends to focus at the national level or at cities, but there's really unique things going on in our rural communities that might require their own specific investigation. And so I'm going to share a few different projects that I've taken on since I've gone to the University of Iowa and pursued more training in community engaged research. And just thinking about, how do communities respond to these stresses related to immigration, and do the responses mitigate harms to health and well-being? And I think my feeling, as a young researcher who was pretty embedded in my community, was that we had a good amount of evidence at this point that immigration enforcement was not a good thing for health. And so what are we going to do about it? And there's a few different approaches. Luckily, public health has a framework for thinking about this. When you know something is bad for people's health, when you know there's a threat, we can think about primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention means kind of going to the root of the problem, eliminating the thing that causes bad health in the first place. That's really important, but sometimes hard to do. There's also secondary prevention, where you might think about, how can we catch this early? How can we stop it from progressing? And then there's tertiary prevention, how can we help people cope and thrive and survive under these circumstances? So it's, I feel like I'm pushing the field of public health a little bit to extend this to immigration enforcement, but I think it's important to think about all those levels, so short of comprehensive immigration reform, where we totally overhaul our immigration enforcement system, there's a lot of ways that immigrant communities are taking care of each other, are mitigating the harms to health right now, and what are ways that as researchers we could understand what people are doing to take care of themselves and their families and support them and bolster that. We need to do both things at once. I thought that was a way that I might be able to help. And so the first project is one that I've taken on with my colleague William Lopez. He's at the University of Michigan, and we met when we were doing our PhDs at the same time. Actually, he was part of the study team that came here 3 years ago. We teamed up with local community organizations to evaluate locally issued ID cards. Have people heard about those, like a city ID or a county ID? So in places where people aren't allowed to get a state driver's license or a state ID without a social security number or a visa, there's local governments who have said, it's still worth it for us to have people able to identify themselves as a resident of this city or this county. So we teamed up with local organizations to think about the ways that those IDs might matter for health. So this is my Johnson County ID from Iowa. Dr. Lopez does a lot of research on immigration raids as well. And we were pretty concerned in April of 2018 when we've had the largest immigration raid in over 10 years happen in Bean Station, Tennessee. So it was at a meatpacking plant, and I think it actually took me a few days to even just read the news articles about it because I felt like, here we go again. I think we were innocent and thought that maybe worksite raids were done, but they're definitely not. And so that was 97 workers arrested in Bean Station, and then a month later, an hour from the town where all of us from University of Iowa live, there was a raid where 32 workers were detained. And it went on. So there were 6 large worksite immigration raids last year, meaning that the worksite immigration raids surged by 400% in 2018. This is a graph from National Immigration Law Center, or more of a timeline really, just tracking the really big raids that have been happening and getting bigger and bigger over the past year. So this covers the 5 largest ones from last year, ranging all the way up to 160 arrests in Sumner, Texas. And then just a few months ago in Allen, Texas, there were 284 arrests at a cell phone company. So these raids are back, and they're really concerning from a public health perspective. And then, something that I'm still Dr. Lopez and I are still making sense of, but we were contacted by people from some of these communities after the raid and ended up sort of organically developing what has now become a full-blown study of what happens in these communities after there's a large worksite raid. And so we started, we have a partner in each of the sites, usually someone who reached out to us or someone we knew through other presentations or advocacy or other conversations we were having. And we're going to each of the 6 communities that had a raid last year to talk to people who helped respond to the raid. And so generally that tends to include 4 main sectors. We're starting to see a real clear pattern how people respond to these raids. Did it go out for a second? Yeah. Yeah, so there's people from the legal sector who come to respond. There's lawyers who help people figure out, do they have a bond? What's their potential to get relief from deportation? There's people from faith communities who are always really essential. I mentioned St. Bridget's Church in Postville. There's an analogous church in every one of these towns. Immigrant and Latino-led advocacy groups are really important in the wake of these events. And then also people from schools. And one thing we found, so we started to build this sort of study design where we would just word of mouth come and say, if you were part of the raid response, we'd love to talk to you. And people would come. We do anonymous interviews. We don't save anything, anybody's name, and we erase any phone number or any way that they communicated with us after we talked to them. And one thing that surprised us, but makes a lot of sense as we analyze our data, is that many of the people who fit this category of raid response are also people who got arrested in the raid and are now home out on bond. So there's multiple communities where people who were arrested are now out on bond and awaiting their hearing, and they're volunteering at the church, at the food pantry that the church has set up for people affected by the raid. Or they're the ones who are helping watch their neighbors' kids while somebody else takes the kids to the doctor. And so we didn't intend to interview people who were directly affected because we weren't sure if that was appropriate, but people have presented themselves and they meet the criteria because they're part of the response themselves. And generally, I talked about this a bit with the Postville, but we're seeing this very clear pattern in all these places, and something that for each place feels like this completely unimaginable event coming out of nowhere that was total chaos. There's actually a lot of patterns. So, as I mentioned, figuring out who's missing, figuring out what children and spouses need. When you have 160 people plucked out of a community, there's kids with disabilities, there's spouses who needed support, there's people who are providing childcare in lots of important ways. There's a lot of fabric of a community, and when you pull people out of it, there's a lot of needs that emerge. There's material survival. So often the person detained is the primary breadwinner for the family. So bills come due almost immediately, and there's a lot of need just for surviving. The legal needs are really important to highlight. So representation in immigration court, and also in some of the communities, people were offered bonds and had to be able to pay them. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then, there's that community level stuff. So recovering economically, rebuilding trust and social capital after such a divisive event. And some other really important themes that we have started to notice is every single one of those raids in 2018 was in a rural community, which is really notable and really affects the kind of response that people are able to launch. So none of the towns that we saw the raids happen in had their own local immigration lawyer. They had to have lawyers come in from somewhere else. And while many of the towns had kind of fledgling Latino advocacy groups or LULAC chapters, things like that, they were often relatively recently established. And a lot of the kind of heavy-hitting organizers for the state were in bigger cities. And they also tended to be places where, this is related to the nascent Latino-led advocacy, there were places where people hadn't been there especially long, maybe 20 years or much less. And they were all places that really typify our divided political climate. So places where it tended to be a more conservative political environment, and the raid really forced a lot of people to kind of feel like they had to take a side, or the idea of supporting their neighbor might be seen as a political act, which is something that was really stigmatized in that community. So this project is ongoing. We have 55 interviews so far, and we're really just treasuring the opportunity to hear from people who've really stepped up to support their neighbor after an event like this. And our goal is to think about, how are people preserving health and well-being? What are ways that we can, support that type of response in our current immigration climate, and connect all of them to each other too. That's one thing that they've all said, is they want to meet people from other towns that have had this happen. And this is just to honor some of the team. So Naomi is here today, and then Juan, Bella, and then Dr. Lopez is there second from the right. So those are some of the folks involved with that project. And then we're going to speak more about this tomorrow, but I just wanted to highlight it as another example of these community-driven responses that are emerging right now in the face of our current economic climate. And the ways that as researchers we can partner with people to document what they're doing and think about what its impact might be, or evaluate what its impact is. So we'll discuss this more tomorrow, but immigration detention is at a high in terms of number of people detained per day. It's about 34,000 people in immigration detention each day in the US right now. And some of the people who are in immigration detention could actually get out if they were able to pay a bond. But immigration bonds are very high. The average in Iowa right now is $5,000, which is actually low on a national scale, where the average is $10,000. And in most cases, you can't do like you do with a criminal bail and go through a bondsman and pay 10%. In most cases, immigration bond needs to be paid in full, in cash, at an ERO, an Enforcement and Removal Operations office, which is often remote from where people live. And being able to get out on bond really increases your chances of getting relief for deportation, which you might be eligible for. And it also helps that person get out, be home, be with their family, hopefully get a work permit, and be able to continue to support their family. There's funds popping up all around the country that raise money to help people pay their bond if they can't afford it. And one of them is in Iowa City, the Eastern Iowa Community Bond Project. And so they raise funds from local donors to effectively give families a loan, because the bond does come back at the close of their immigration case. So to kind of spot people the bond money so they can get out, and then their cases take 3 to 5 years to be resolved with our current immigration court backlog. But that way people can get out and be with their family. Because the only reason that they're detained at that point, they haven't had a hearing before a judge, they haven't had any kind of conviction, they just are detained because they don't have that much cash on hand, whereas someone who is wealthy and in their exact same situation could be out. So the bond project has been listening to the stories of people who have received bond assistance. They all gave permission for photo to be shared. And this was a meeting they had in December. But a lot of them said they wanted to tell their stories. They wanted to talk about what their family had experienced. And so we're partnering with them, based on this frame that the Bond Project used. It's a community-driven organization, only led by volunteers. But thinking about, the ways that immigration detention and then being able to get out on bond matter not just for the person detained, but also their family and their community. One of the co-founders, Elizabeth Bernal, she talked about how she thinks that the project is not just helping people, but helping families. So you pay a bond for one person, but you help a whole family. So we've really listened to them and their understanding of this process, and together we've designed a research study, which you can come hear about more tomorrow, to understand the impact that this project might be having on their community. So just to sum up, I want to highlight that rural immigrant communities face really unique challenges in our current moment, but rural communities also have a lot of strong resources for caring for one another. I've experienced that myself when my family had a natural disaster and our home was flooded, and we had people step up and support us in a time when we needed it. And I think there's a lot of that potential that we could creatively tap into to support immigrants in rural areas. And supporting rural leadership development and listening to rural communities is going to be an essential first step for moving this forward. So I want to thank everyone for your attention. I think we have a little time for questions.